So welcome everybody to this last research seminar of the term. And very fittingly, we're going to have Janine Wedel speaking about Russia and Ukraine and our world of competing visions. Can civil society counter oligarchic capitalism? And Janine Wedel, for those of you who are not familiar with her, she is a researcher, most importantly, a researcher here at the Institute, but also a university professor at the Schar Policy and Government at George Mason University, and also a fellow at Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. And she received her PhD in cultural anthropology from University of California, Berkeley, correct? In 1985, but at the age of 5 years, or something like that.
Yes.
Very, very early PhD. And she has written extensively about governance, corruption, foreign aid, and influence elites, and has published many books. Just going to mention some of them. Unaccountable: How the Establishment Corrupted Our Finances, Freedom, and Politics, and Created an Outsider Class. Pegasus, 2016. Then also Shadow Elite: How the World's New Power Brokers Undermine Democracy, Government, and the Free Market, already in 2009 from Basic Books. And you also have a project here at the Institute, and it's entitled Modern Vikings in the East: Sweden's Role in 1990s Russian Economic Reforms, Institution, Elite Networks, and Informal Practices. But with that said, the floor is yours. Very welcome.
Thank you so much to Gustav Arrhenius and the Institute for the very kind invitation. It's great to be back at the Institute, and it's great to be back at Midsummer. This quote is from an American.
That's rather correct.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has catapulted several compelling storylines into the Western media. One is of oligarchs close to Vladimir Putin who've been singled out for sanctions. We've seen oligarchs' yachts seized and their assets, that is, those that can be found, frozen. A separate but also war-related storyline revolves around Ukrainian soldiers and resolute citizens resisting the Russian invasion. We see the resolve of the Ukrainian people and the many ways that they come to each other's aid. On the surface, these stories, that of the oligarchs and that of resistance to the invaders, appear unrelated. Today I show how they are in fact intertwined. Indeed, the oligarchs and clans that emerged from the old Soviet Union and the civil society that today underpins Ukrainian resistance are two sides of the same coin. Two rival and equally robust visions are at work in our world, and not only in Eastern Europe. One is what has been called oligarchic capitalism, the other is civil society. And while there are many definitions of civil society, the definition I'm using here is, roughly speaking, people working together to help fashion a better collective future of democracy, rule of law, human rights, free press. Civil society involves both formal and informal organization. Whichever vision takes hold in Ukraine also portends what may well happen with Western democracy. To make this case, I'll trace the rise of oligarchic capitalism in Russia and Ukraine, as well as in Ukraine, then discuss the spread of oligarchic capitalism beyond post-Soviet space and the rise of shadow elites in liberal democracies. 3, examine Ukrainian civil society and how it can serve as a counterweight to corruption. And finally, ask what these two rival visions portend, not only for Ukrainian and Russian society, but for Western democracies. The two visions augur two paths of civilization, paths that are both different and competing. I come to this work as a social and political anthropologist. I got my start studying and living in 1980s communist Poland, where I worked on informal social and economic networks and system. And I continued working in Central Europe, Russia, and Ukraine in the decades after communism's collapse. In recent years, as I've turned much of my attention to the United States and the West, my East European experience has proven astoundingly helpful for understanding what's happening to Western democracies. So let's begin with the end of the Soviet Union and the informal structures that arose from it. How did the oligarchs and clans develop in Russia and Ukraine? So historically, when the command structure of a centrally planned state breaks down and no authoritarian stand-in is put in to replace it, a network-based mode of governing and business arises to replace it. Under these circumstances, you only work with people that you trust. So networks are only based on trust. In the late 1980s in Poland, as communism was unraveling, and before the Berlin Wall fell, I watched how people in long-standing informal networks rose to take control of their lives, to reduce state constraints on private business, lobby for environmental cleanup, and build private schools and homes. And then when communism finally fell, help shape a new system of government. Whatever the goal of the particular group, the loyalty of such groups is always to the network, the trusted people in the network, even at the expense of the organizations, government, private, that individuals within them supposedly serve. Throughout Eastern Europe, these elite networks appeared to fill leadership vacuums. They were highly dense and interconnected, with the same people coming up in multiple roles vis-a-vis each other in government, business, NGOs, and think tanks to access the resources and influence necessary to further their group's goals. The groups cannot be reduced to lobbying organizations, clubs, interest groups, or political parties. They incorporate features of all of these. Throughout the region, after communism officially collapsed in Central and Eastern Europe in 1989 and 1991, the Soviet Union, the privatization of state-owned resources and enterprise was seen as one of the main tasks of so-called transition to market economy, both by post-communist states and, importantly, by the West. As privatization schemes were put into place, the kinds of informal networks I've just described played pivotal roles in the distribution and extraction of previously owned state property, industry, wealth, resources. So, in Ukraine and Russia, scholars and journalists called these political financial power networks, called them clans, invoking a kind of kinship connotation of closeness, brotherhood, mutual support, where no actual family relationship usually existed. Of course, part of these clans were built on relationships created through, say, KGB, Secret Service institutions. The way clans operate has been dubbed dirty togetherness. Loyalty is to the clan and to promoting the group's agenda, whatever that might be, rather than to the broader public interest and or the state and private organizations for which clan members formally work. And the cost of defection is very high. In Russia, privatization could not have been more high stakes. Oil and gas, valuable minerals, and other crown jewels of the vast Soviet Empire were all up for grabs. There, what I call a clan state arose in the 1990s. The most powerful clans were in industries dealing with natural resources, oil, gas, metals, the FSB, which is the successor organization to the KGB, the economy, military. The most important clans, powerful clans, arose there. As clans mobilized to exert control over these and other valuable arenas, they had their feet firmly planted both in segments of the state and in private sector organizations relevant to achieving their group's agendas. They merge state and private power. Players don't have to choose between the state and the private sector. They fuse them. They also fuse formal and informal power. Dirtily together in tight-knit networks, their members snake through business, politics, and government to serve their agendas. In Russia and elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, a symbiotic relationship arose between the criminal, business, and political worlds, and power networks were much more likely to cross into criminal activity than, say, in Poland and other parts of Central and Eastern Europe. And there was much more at stake in vast and resource-rich Russia and Ukraine than in Central and Eastern Europe. One clan that I studied up close was the Chubais clan, named after its young so-called reformer, Anatoly Chubais. It had earlier coalesced through a club of young intellectuals and then teamed up with advisors from Harvard University to carry out economic reform and privatization. It became one of the most powerful clans in the 1990s, especially the early 1990s. Its comparative advantage in Russia was its access to hundreds of millions of dollars of Western aid, which at that time was a lot of money, to serve the clan's agendas and to carry out its preferred controversial privatization schemes. Members of the Chubais clan operated in an anti-democratic way and straddled multiple and mutually reinforcing formal and informal roles across government and foreign aid private organizations and economic organizations. Foreign aid was a 1990s issue, but the structures created by these relationships would later also facilitate the corruption of some Western leaders. For example, German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, whom I'll discuss, operates like a clan member. Thanks to the corrupt privatization schemes, oligarchs arose virtually overnight, becoming instant millionaires and even billionaires. This is how we got the so-called oligarchs in that part of the world. It's no accident that Russians came to call privatization grabitization. Each clan operating in 1990s Russia, together with the people we refer to as oligarchs, who are keepers of the assets, oligarchs are keepers of the assets, ran their own kleptocratic resource extraction and offshoring operation. They competed with each other for power and influence. And though we hear a lot about oligarchs and almost nothing about clans, oligarchs are actually subordinate to clan leaders. Two oligarchs associated with the Chubais clan that you might have heard of were Mikhail Friedman and Petr Avin of Alfa Bank, the biggest private bank in Russia. Those were the heady 1990s under President Boris Yeltsin. So how did the operating system develop under Vladimir Putin, a KGB officer and clan member? In the early 2000s, immediately after Putin was appointed Yeltsin's successor, he began to consolidate power and root out the clans and the oligarchs who would challenge him, inserting his own people. The clans and the structures they set up increasingly began to serve the strategic interests of the Russian state, that is, the clan state. A perfect example is Gazprom, the natural gas conglomerate created from the Soviet gas ministry and led by KGB operatives and Putin cronies. The ministry was nominally privatized in 1993, but the Russian government holds a controlling stake, and Gazprom is in practice a strategic state organization. In 1993, in an official document, Gazprom outlined the state's strategy for the development of exports as well as for entry into networks of energy distribution through joint ventures with mega Western corporations. The document specifies the goals of dominating the gas market of the entire EU, including building pipelines, and dominating political structures of countries where pipelines are located. Entry into the banking sector, either through joint ventures or through its own private banks, also specified, and lobbying, read political corruption, to accomplish these goals. By the way, Gazprom KGB-associated clans, along with the FSB itself, which is the successor organization, are suspected of some of the current political murders of oligarchs. In short, the Gazprom document and the unfolding of events shows how at least some Russian elites from the beginning set out to play a big strategic game with the world. Their biggest weapon is their oil and gas. They've never used nuclear weapons, but they've long weaponized oil and gas. At the same time as Putin was reining in the unfavorable clans and oligarchs, he also set out to destroy the strong civil society, NGOs, and free press that had begun to intensively develop in the beginning of the 1990s. Since 2012, when Putin began his third term as president, the clans and oligarchs have been firmly in his grip and doing his bidding, whether they liked it or not. Some of that activity has involved working as instruments of Putin's foreign policy. For example, oligarchs Avin and Friedman and their Alpha Bank are a case in point, named by U.S. Special Counsel Robert Mueller in his report into the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Fast forward to today, and we see that by controlling the clans and oligarchs over the past 2 decades and liquidating civil society, NGOs, free press, Putin has destroyed the only extant mechanisms of pluralism, if you can call it that, so that today the only real power left standing appears to be security intelligence groups. Democracy has imploded. And there is no succession procedure beyond Putin. So how does this differ from Ukraine? Russia and Ukraine started off from similar places, and on the surface, that is, started out in 1991, from similar places, and on the surface, clans developed quite similarly in the 1990s, but then diverged greatly in the subsequent 30 years. In Russia, clans came to serve the strategic vision of the state, that is, the clan state, but not in Ukraine. First, Ukraine didn't quite have a strategic vision. There was a vision to build a state, but no comparable plan for building its strategic position or international strategy. Second, unlike in Russia, no single anchor has arisen in Ukraine to consolidate power or to rein in competing oligarchs, competing clans. There are multiple power centers, and they compete with each other. Many states in Ukraine, many states that own think tanks, NGOs, politicians, and even armies, all promoting their own interests in the face of a weak state. At the same time, the weakening of the Ukrainian state through clans and oligarchs has created an opening for civil society, societal initiatives, and self-governing. And at the same time, Ukraine has remained a democracy with competitive elections. One of Ukraine's big challenges has been the Kremlin's many and varied efforts, and not just military ones: cyber war, propaganda war, strategic political corruption, to keep Ukraine from succeeding as an independent state. As part of the Kremlin's big strategic game, enlarging its influence by corrupting the institutions and systems of democratic states, Ukraine has been a playground of experimentation. Methods first used there have also been deployed and in Western Europe and the United States. And it's no secret that right-wing parties are being supported in Europe, are being supported by the Kremlin. Since the first Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the Ukrainian state has become stronger and in the ensuing 8 years even managed to put limits on the city-states of the clans, oligarchs, including some that were serving Russia, the Kremlin's agenda. The army began to be rebuilt and the police and judiciary reformed. There was a very good chance that this bolstering of the state might not succeed. Yet today we see, through Ukraine's organization and performance in the war, that it has succeeded, at least to some considerable degree. So, now let's move to 2. The spread of oligarchic capitalism beyond post-Soviet space. So, what has happened? In my analysis, oligarchic capitalism from the East, along with developments emanating from the West, like outsourcing, the contracting out of government functions, privatization, deregulation, financialization, and digitization have combined to give rise to a new ecosystem and a novel breed of players to take advantage of it. Oligarchization of the East influenced the West, and negatively so. And now, of course, the world is undergoing further reorganization, including on a macro scale, due to the war in Ukraine. The result of these developments, including the spread of oligarchic capitalism and those that emanated from the West, is that patterns of elite behavior, influencing and corruption that I saw in the aftermath of communism as new political economies took shape have been systematically emerging in the West, as detailed in these 2 books. But the West is not a blind importer of oligarchic capitalism from the East. We are co-creators of certain post-Cold War financial, governance, and PR structures which we thrive on and that promote oligarchic capitalism and protect corrupt elites. There have been at least 2 key areas of massive cooperation. The first is finance. Amid the avalanche of opportunity as a resource-rich empire, the Soviet Union, fell and privatized, financial architectures were forged and bolstered to handle the explosion of money laundering, offshoring, and tax evasion. An entire industry of so-called enablers of oligarchs sprung up in the West. Now, there's a burgeoning literature today on enablers and the enabler industry under this label, but I would submit that the enablers are actually, in most cases, co-designers, if not sole designers, of these new architectures. They are bankers, tax experts, lawyers, accountants, who have not only become fabulously wealthy, but also dependent on the tidal wave of dirty money. The scale is mind-boggling. Russia was the biggest country of origin of billionaires in the financial documents dubbed the Pandora Papers, according to the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which unearthed the documents. The money flows into the world's financial centers, notably in Europe and North America, and into banks like JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Deutsche Bank. There, as scholars Hus and Poshkai Alvarez have written, it is hidden, laundered, reinvested, and put into political action in the host countries. Russian money, they argue, has served Moscow in at least 2 ways. First, it strengthened Putin's hold on power by tying business leader, read oligarchs, and clans to clientelist networks and discouraging would-be reformers. And second, it created dependencies between economic sectors and enablers in the West and the fortunes of oligarchs working for Putin, making both sides greatly amenable to the Kremlin's agenda and eroding the political legitimacy of democratically elected leaders. This has created, they write, asymmetrical cross-national dependencies that open channels for illegitimate influence and compromise the political stability and defense capabilities of target countries. The second area of massive collaboration and growth is the PR industry and the Western enablers who help launder the reputations of oligarchs. While serving Putin's agenda, oligarchs had to legitimize themselves in important Western circles and create civic reputations. So they set up foundations and philanthropies and donated millions of dollars to august institutions. Petra Aven, whom I mentioned earlier, received corporate citizenship in the prestigious Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Len Blavatnik, who partnered with oligarchs and organized crime figures carrying out Putin's wishes, and whom the U.S. Treasury sanctioned for furthering, quote, worldwide malign activity, including intrusion in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, has donated to Harvard and the iconic Council on Foreign Relations, and many others, not to mention setting up the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford. The enabling industry that fosters such reputation laundering consists not only of prestigious institutions and bona fide PR firms. Statesmen are also perpetrators. Take Michael Chertoff, former U.S. Homeland Security Chief, former Mr. Homeland Security, for example. He chairs the board of Freedom House. How many of you know Freedom House, that puts out the democracy indices and tracks supposedly the state of democracy around the world? He chairs the board of Freedom House and yet also serves on the legal team of the notorious Ukrainian oligarch and organized crime figure Dmytro Firtash. Firtash was so embedded with Russian organized crime and influencing that he fled Ukraine with the Ukrainian Russian puppet ruler in the 2014 revolution. Then there are leaders of the former leaders of the free world who have helped normalize both financial and image laundering practices in the West while directly serving Kremlin interests. Consider Gerhard Schröder. While German Chancellor Schröder agreed to a pipeline deal with the Russian energy giant Gazprom that many believed was contrary to Germany's national interest. Gazprom, and this is Berlin headquarters, in turn gave him a lucrative job. In a 2004 meeting in Kaliningrad of Schröder, Putin, and French President Jacques Chirac, Schröder accepted this job before he even left office. Recall that the strategy of Gazprom and the Russian state has been to cast a wide net of political corruption. In the subsequent 18 years, Schröder has earned millions while promoting Russian energy interests, and Germany's reliance on Russian gas surged to 55% before Russia's February attack on Ukraine, from 39% in 2001, earning Gazprom, with that majority status, the monopoly, and the Kremlin monopoly power in Germany. Schröder also has and does serve as a reliable advocate for Putin more generally. Today, Schröder is sharply criticized in Germany for his attitude and his role as chair of the shareholder committee of Nord Stream and head of the supervisory board of Nord Stream 2, which built a second pipeline connecting Russia to Germany under the Baltic Sea. Schröder and other German Social Democrats, I should add, have actively lobbied for Nord Stream 2. With regard to its interest in Ukraine, the Kremlin has concertedly sought to sway opinion on Ukraine through various means, including by secretly paying prominent politicians. A handful of former European legislatures, former European parliamentarians, dubbed the Habsburg Group, were engaged to sway policymakers in the United States, in fact, on behalf of pro-Russian interests in Ukraine. The fact that they were being paid to do this, of course, wasn't disclosed, And none other than Paul Manafort, and this is his mugshot. He did actually go to prison for a little while, but was pardoned by Trump. So he was Trump's campaign chairman. And along with another Trump crony were the fixers behind this effort. These operatives, too, were named in the report of Special Counsel Robert Mueller, who led this investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Donald Trump himself and his political cronies are, of course, premier examples of allegedly succumbing to Kremlin strategic corruption. We can talk about that in Q&A if you'd like to know more specifics if you don't already. These former statesmen exemplify a larger pattern of how today's elite influencers operate. This is the new establishment corruption in which legitimate players engage in illegitimate activities to unabashedly pursue their agendas that promote oligarchic capitalism and even serve foreign malign interests. This is business as usual across the political spectrum. An age-old definition of corruption that one finds both in the Bible and in the Quran is corruption as violation of public trust. Violation of public trust. These elites often do precisely that. Clearly, norms and ways and means of operating have changed, along with the culture of what is deemed acceptable. Activities that would have been unacceptable and even punishable 20 years ago are now simply business as usual. But acceptable to whom? Not typically the teacher, postman, or coal miner with stagnant wages. Given oligarchic capitalism and the rise of shadow elites, it should come as no surprise that over the same period that they established themselves, wealth inequalities have surged. It should also come as no surprise that during this period of soaring inequality, trust in public institutions has plummeted, whether it's governments, parliaments, and courts, or banks and corporations, or the media. Even in Sweden, as I understand it, this is a global phenomenon. Taking all this into account, the rise of the surge in wealth inequalities and decline in public trust, it's fairly easy to understand the growth of Trumpism and other anti-system movements across Europe, notwithstanding how exponentially worse these leaders make things when they actually do come to power. So let's move to point 3. Ukrainian civil society as a potential counterweight to corruption and oligarchic influence. Let me be clear. Oligarchic capitalism has thrived in Ukraine, just as in Russia. Corruption in Ukraine has been widespread, from the clan oligarch structures that I've discussed to bribery in healthcare, education, public services. At the same time, there's been an open public discussion, indeed, everyday conversation of regular people about the need to counter corruption. While in Russia, the clan state has crushed civil society and democracy, in Ukraine, neither corruption nor the state, which remains democratic, managed to destroy them. To the contrary, Ukrainian civil society has become stronger. It might have seemed before the war in Ukraine that corruption had swallowed civil society. But apparently over 30 years, 2 revolutions, and the massive mobilization of civil society following the first, that is 2004 Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukrainian identity and civil society have become stronger with each. The same spirit motivating Ukrainian soldiers and citizens has also powered the civil society and anti-corruption movement. The resistance that we now see cannot be explained by lone soldiers on the front lines. An entire army of volunteer cooks and helpers supports them. Let's talk very briefly about Ukrainian identity and civil society in the face of Russian colonization. Russian rulers have long been trying to erase the very idea of Ukraine, from the Tsar's banning of Ukrainian schools and language books to the imprisoning of Ukrainian patriots and dismissing the region as Little Russia under the Tsars, to Putin's insistence that the Ukrainian nation doesn't and shouldn't exist. Exploitation by Russia has gone as far as genocide. In the early 1930s, Stalin forced collectivization of agriculture, as a result of which at least 4 million Ukrainian peasants starved to death, as well as of course, killing intellectuals and artists. Ukrainians have always had their own separate identity that was noticeably reinforced after the 2014 annexation of Crimea and takeover of Donbass by Russian proxies. I spent a year there under a Fulbright fellowship in 2015 and 16, and many Ukrainians from different areas of the country and different walks of life told me something to the effect that, now I realize how Ukrainian I really am. I saw how the invasion united people around the idea of Ukrainian nationhood. Unlike Russians, Ukrainians have a history of public space, which is an indicator that collective action, and hence civil society, is possible. And here we see the public gatherings over the Christmas holidays that go on for 6 weeks, and at least in my experience, are everywhere as elaborate and well attended as, say, Weihnachtszeiten in Berlin. They build a winterized stage for symphony, ballet, rock bands, and they come and perform every night, and they're very, very well attended. And the communal spirit develops. Public parks in Ukraine are legendary, and a small park in my former neighborhood also displays a sense of humor. During and after the last revolution and today, Ukrainians have used music as a form of resistance. In 2015, I saw pianos around Kiev and other cities in public spaces, and professional musicians would come just spontaneously to perform, and people would gather around them to listen, participate, sing, whatever. Ukrainian culture, the idea goes, will help the nation succeed. In the past week or so, the Odessa Opera House, remember Odessa has been being shelled, has reopened precisely in that spirit. Ukrainian identity and civil society have translated into efforts to resist the influence of the country's clans, oligarchs, and corruption, as well as Kremlin intervention. Indeed, corruption was one of the main reasons for both the 2004 Orange Revolution and the 2013-14 Euromaidan revolution of dignity that overthrew Viktor Yanukovych, the kleptocratic Putin puppet president of Ukraine. And here we see again Paul Manafort in the middle with his buddy Trump and Yanukovych. This is the major English language daily or paper in Ukraine. At the core of both of these revolutions was a rejection of Ukraine's corrupt system and the demand for the creation of an economy and society based on Western and European norms. People who participated in these revolutions came from diverse social and economic backgrounds, diverse parts of the country, languages, ethnicities, ages, and political ideologies. Not to be too optimistic, but in recent years, Ukraine has developed a considerable anti-corruption movement replete with numerous NGOs and succeeded in installing anti-corruption state institutions. Yet, how successful have the revolutions and anti-corruption efforts actually been in countering corruption and clan oligarchic influence? Well, both revolutions led to the establishment of a mixed parliamentary presidential system, political and ideological pluralism, the decline of the prior presidential administration, and a reduced role for clans in public politics. However, these effects are judged to have been only temporary. The clan state repeatedly has reemerged. Disgust with continuing corruption drove the most recent presidential elections of both Petro Poroshenko and Vladimir Zelensky. And while Zelensky campaigned on an anti-corruption platform, within a year into his term, his popularity had declined precipitously, partly explained in terms of perceived inaction on corruption. That was before the invasion. So, what is happening today? Ukrainians are defending the motherland and also defending Ukraine as a project. After the first invasion, civic action became even stronger and a so-called volunteer movement, that's what they call it, arose. Volunteers initially assisted the estimated 1.5 IDPs, or internally displaced persons, that were created by the Russian intervention in Crimea and Donbass. And then they also expanded to work on social reform in areas that include, say, public oversight of government. It's no accident that, with regard to public trust, volunteers are now one of the most three trusted groups in the country, alongside the church and the military. As you might imagine, these kinds of efforts since the February invasion have skyrocketed. So on the left you see some acquaintances who raised money to buy a car so that they could deliver relief supplies to hospitals and elderly people, self-organized activity. But these efforts are not only on a small scale. Consider the evacuation of 5 million women and children, mostly organized, as I understand it, at the municipal level, and about half of them into Poland and then other neighboring countries. Consider that effort since the war began, 5 million women and children. Some Ukrainian anti-corruption experts have for years highlighted the need for the United States and other countries to dismantle the financial structures, practices, and policies that enable oligarchic capitalism. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has spotlighted the urgency to do just that, and there's been a whirlwind of increased activity on that front in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere. A lot of testimony happening, and a lot of new bills and such being introduced, as I see in Washington. And Ukrainian experts and activists who for years were involved in that are now being called upon routinely to work on this issue. So in closing today, I've tried to shed light on how we got to the present state of affairs. European, Ukrainian, and experts and activists from around the world in the anti-corruption area have been showing what needs to be done to change the state of affairs for years. In an article titled "Ukraine is Our Past and Our Future," the British journalist and LSE scholar Peter Pomerantsev describes Ukraine as a crucible of so much horror in history. Recall that during the 20th century, an estimated 14 million people, not only Ukrainians, perished on Ukrainian soil in one mass slaughter after another, as detailed in Bloodlands by the Yale historian Timothy Schneider. While, and perhaps because Ukraine has been the site of so much horror, Pomerantsev writes, It has also produced the ideas, sources, and policies that define good from bad for all of us. For instance, it was a lawyer from Lviv, Ukraine, whose parents had perished in the Holocaust, who came up with the concept of crimes against humanity. Another Lviv-educated lawyer gave us the concept of genocide. These ideas have provided the basis for doctrines like humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect. Finally, and this is a jumping off point for discussion. So, what do these two competing visions, oligarchic capitalism and civil society, portend not only for Ukrainian and Russian society, but for liberal democracies? What do we want for our own societies? What do they argue for us? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Join me in thanking Janine for this great talk.
You're welcome.
So this is the last seminar before the summer break, but we already have lined up some seminars for the fall. We have September 7th, Kirsti Gover from Melbourne Law School. September 14th, Katie Steele, coming here, our own Katie Steele. And we have September 21st, Stephen Gardner coming. So welcome back after the summer.